Right. This is a giving assignment, a giving topic. That's the first time in my career I've been sort of writing an assignment with a given topic. I hope I meet the expectation of the club. Yesterday night when I was having the dinner, the nice dinner, I feel a bit guilty because the Prime Minister, the President of the club was talking about the definition of shared society, and I realized, I'm going to talk about inequality or equality alone, mostly on this sort of income dimension. I thought that's a bit narrow, but then since this morning, everyone been talking about income inequality, so I feel much better. I can deliver this. Now, of course, I'm going to focus on China, and it's not a research paper as I discussed with Wim by email. So it's a kind of review and research paper. So we'll have contain both elements. Just a background, of course, we all know China has been growing very fast and has been growing for quite long, more than 30 years at almost double-digit growth rate. And this growth, of course, has a lot of implications, not only for Chinese, but for virtually many people outside China as well. And one of the things, of course, we talk about a lot is really the implication of China's rise on a global scale and China become a major global power. Just over the coffee break, Wim told me already there are people saying China I was saying in my paper, China will overtake the United States, become the largest economy by 2025. But he said that happened 2 years ago. So China is first or the second largest economy. But no doubt it is quite big. And China's growth, of course, actually helped to really promote the rise of Asia. I mean, you can think without China's growth, will Asia rise so fast? I mean, that's a counterfactual question we got to ask. Of course, this growth has a lot of implications for Chinese. I mean, I can say it means a better life for almost every Chinese, but that doesn't mean every Chinese gained at the same rate. And that's a key question we're going to address. And after 30 years growth, a lot of serious challenges, confronting Chinese, the government, the population, and of course, those stakeholders outside of China. One, a very serious problem is corruption. Corruption is everywhere in China, but that's not the topic I can address. To me, that partially really is got to wait for political reform, which the government, the current leadership has been talking about a lot, but has done very little so far. Whether that's going to happen for the next leadership, I don't really know. But anyhow, that's not I'm concerned. The second major problem confronting the Chinese economy is really this growth pattern. Now, in some other countries, today we discussed, they have too little savings, like in Europe. But in China, they have too much savings. They basically save more than half of their GDP. They consume less than half of their GDP. And the government has been doing this, try to increase consumption for more than 15 years, but it's not really happening. And that's a major problem. And this problem actually relates to this income inequality we're going to discuss. Then, of course, externally, we have the China facing a lot of problems as well. They export too much. And of course, that relates to sluggish sort of domestic consumption. And that causes a lot of problems with the United States and even Europe. They export because exporting, the mean is really taking jobs away from a lot of people in those countries. So, and that's the external side. And of course, domestic, apart from corruption, they're probably the second most important socio-economic question challenge is really inequality. And that's well recognized. It's not disputable. It's not sort of controversial. People realize this is getting more and more serious. It's getting worse and worse, and it's a time bomb. Anytime will explode. I've been talking about this issue in China in many important institutions, and people are asking, say that we agree it's a time bomb, but can you tell us when that will explode? I said, I don't really know when that will explode, but if we don't manage properly, it's going to explode, and the consequences is very, very serious. So we have to really deal with this income inequality problem in China. But as far as inequality in China is concerned, there's a lot of writings, a fairly good sort of literature. And of course, there are a lot of interests, not only from academics, policymakers, from business community, from international organizations, which are from every angle, globally, really looking into the inequality issue in China. It's because it, of course, affects China's sort of growth prospect. And that, of course, has implications for a lot of people, and also for the international inequality. Somebody mentioned this morning, actually, China's inequality is rising, and that helps push the global inequality. And China's globalization, of course, China is one of the most globalized economy. It's actually more open. If you use openness index by economics, more open than the United States, than many other economies in the world. And this globalization actually raised within country inequality even in developed countries. I mean, what it's saying is because of the export, so Chinese actually taking away jobs from blue-collar workers in the United States, so they become poorer, and the income inequality in the United States is growing. So they're not saying that's only sort of pushing up the inequality in China, but it's pushing equality in Europe, in America, in everywhere. So China is responsible not only for those trade problems, but for equality as well. So then, of course, earlier we saw this dominance of within country equality in a sort of global picture. I mean, I was asking that question. I mean, my understanding is that global inequality is rising, but actually the between country equality are narrowing down, but it's really the rise of within all these, within each countries. That's the main problem, and that's where, I'm sort of focusing on in this paper. I'm going to focus on this sort of inequality inside China, not sort of across borders. Now, I'm not going to tell you how important this issue is in China and globally. I'm sure you all know that. But despite this importance and growing literature, the significance, the interest, but if you go to the literature, you will find there are a lot of missing pieces on China's inequality. Of course, when you talk about inequality, you start with measurement. You want to see whether how large, how small, how it, but there are different dimensions of inequality, which is really not very clear in the literature. People, pick up one dimension, they make statements on that. Then the second part, of course, you want to look at the trend. If the inequality is coming down, then people get relieved, and the policymakers, actually in China right now, there's a small group of economists are saying inequality in China is coming down, and don't worry about it. Don't do anything, not to worry because they're coming down. But I'm not sure. And that's where the trend comes in. Not only measure the inequality at statically at in individual years, how high, how low, but how it changes over time. And we don't. If you look at the literature, well, Chinese government doesn't really publish inequality numbers for over time. And you look at the literature, there's no consistent, systematic study on this inequality. So you pick up scatter information on how large each coefficient is, and maybe over 2 or 3 year period, they can show some trend, but there's no really consistent time series, time profile. And then, of course, the impact of inequality. I mean, people can qualitatively talk about, how bad inequality is, but we got to remember China was quite equal before the reform, and it was the equality which caused a lot of problem in the Chinese economy. That's where they started to break down the equality, try to really start up the economy. And now, of course, after 30 years of growth, it causes a lot of problems. But yet, very few studies try to really identify and analyze the impacts of this growing inequality on different things, on growth, on consumption, on crime, on health problems, all sorts of issues, but very little research. And that's, of course, partly because there are no sort of long-time serious data on inequality in China. And of course, the most important part is drivers of inequality. What drives inequality? China has been fighting equality for 15, 20 years, and yet inequality has been growing all the time instead of coming down, until recently, few years. It's not the government doesn't want to do anything. They did a lot of things. They invested a lot of money, initiated a lot of policies, but it's not working. And to me, it's where the research problem is. People have not really identified what really the fundamental drivers of inequality and where the policy interventions should focus. Now we know that. One example I can give you is this huge investment in the West development campaign. They put huge amount to develop the West. But later you will say that as far as inequality is concerned, this is the wrong policy because it's not really addressing the major component of inequality. So we'll see that. And of course, that's just one example, and that requires really a careful analysis of inequality in China. Now, so coming to the analyzing equality in China, first, on measurement, we got to be clear on what variables we are using, whether we measure income inequality, consumption equality, or wage inequality, or inequality in assets, and so on. We must be clear on this issue. And also, when you talk about inequality, at what level you measure inequality? And if you know the literature, there are people talk about regional inequality, there are people talk about gender gap, there are people talking about sector segregation, and of course, you have individual, inequality between individuals or households, and that got to be clear. And another issue which is very important, and for China, particularly for China, is this special price deflator. Many people just pick up the data and calculate Gini coefficients and so on, but you got to realize, China is a huge country. Also, it's not really very well integrated yet, despite 30 years of market development. So price levels differ considerably, dramatically actually, across different parts of China. That means different really purchasing power. And you can't really just take the nominal income or consumption level and do, work out the inequality. Now, I can tell you, I don't really have data here, but this, without considering this price deflator across the location, you're going to overestimate inequality in China by about 20%. This is quite a lot. Yeah? So that's the third issue about measurement. Then on the trend analysis, the main problem is really the data. If you have data, of course, it's pretty easy to carry. But the trouble is, Chinese, they do have household level survey data back in the mid or even earlier, mid-70s or earlier. But the trouble is, they never release. They don't even release to the government research institutions, not to anybody. Not to Asian Development Bank. We try to go through the back doors. I don't know whether we'll succeed, but we're trying. World Bank managed to get hold of some of the data, but the data they have, we just recently discovered, they may actually have a problem as well with that data set because World Bank just recently released global poverty numbers, and we did that last year, and we have some inconsistencies. But when it comes to China, we believe we got it right, they got it wrong. They got it wrong, they got the right data, but they got the wrong number. I think it's the data they got is not really representative. Yeah. So the data is a big issue, and that's something I had a lot of trouble. Later on, I will come back to this point. That's why I told Wim over email, you don't see much work, but it's a lot of amount of work I put in for this paper. Just updating a couple of years, it's cost me a lot of time because of this data problem, and we managed to overcome that. Then the impacts, not really much work being done, but again, in this paper, I'm not going to focus on that. The impacts on growth. We did a paper, I think it was 5-6 years ago, and we could find out inequality rise in China actually is actually hurting growth in China right now, but not, of course, before the reform. And you got to, when you talk about the impact of growth, you really got to separate short run, medium run, and the long run, because as I said, in the short run, the inequality may not hurt growth, sometimes may promote growth, because there are some positive aspects of rising equality. We cannot say inequality rise is always bad, 100%, but there are some positive sides to that. And I haven't seen people working on that impact of inequality on corruption, which in China is pretty high, and there are people now very much concerned about corruption and inequality because the economically powerful line up with the politically powerful. And when that happens, it's going to be a huge, huge problem, and China may not be able to tackle that. And that's really something, personally, I'm quite concerned. And of course, the impact of inequality on education already is quite obvious in China. A lot of poor families cannot afford their kids to high schools and universities, although primary school education now is universalized and provided by the government. But as earlier, some of our speakers, said, really in the end, it's not only primary school, it's really, the higher level of education, which is important for the growth and for the households to step out of poverty. And on some other issues, which again, I'm not going to focus on in this paper. The main part of my paper, really the innovative part, is really try to identify some drivers. What really causes inequality in China? Now, it's probably unfair to say people did not work on the drivers of inequality in China. They did, but they basically providing a laundry list. And that's not very useful because for policymakers, I've been saying to a lot of researchers, policymakers actually knows better than academics, what are the possible causes. The trouble is they don't know which one is more important, which one should be tackled from what angle. And that's where the research is important. So hopefully, this paper will give you a sort of a clearer idea as to which factors contribute more and which factors contribute less to the inequality. So now, so far you see this inequality issue is so big, covers a lot of grounds, but I got to really try to define the scope of this paper. In this paper, basically, I'm trying to do three things. One is I'm going to try to use official and also unofficial data to try to measure the measurement part. Measure regional and inter-household inequality in income or consumption. So that's very clear, not assets, not wage, yeah? And it's at a regional and inter-household level because we don't have data on the individual level, yeah? And we have official and unofficial data on that. The second part I'm going to do is construct a time profile, time series, actually try to go back to late 70s, and that has been absent in the literature. And then we try to identify, quantify the drivers. That's, I just mentioned, and we're going to come back to that, of course. And finally, try to come up with some policy implications, policy recommendations based on the, sort of the analysis on the drivers of inequality in China. In order to do that, we not only need to dig out data, but we also need some methodology to come with that. As I said, we don't have household level data. I mean, we do, officially we don't. Officially, they do have, I don't know, they have 200, maybe 400,000 households covered under surveys, annual surveys, but we don't have access to that data. Fortunately, if you go back to the official statistical yearbook of China, they publish group data. What they do is they will publish the bottom 10% of population earns 3% of income, the next 10% earns 5.5%, and so on and so on. So you get probably 6, maybe if you like 10 points for a country of 1.3 billion people. And of course, people were asked, how useful is that? Well, it's not very, very useful if you don't do something about it. And that's where we need some sort of a methodology, and that's where we're going to use this ungrouping methodology. So they group the data, we're going to ungroup them, and that's a methodology. That's why I worked with Tony Sharks when I was back in Wilder. And actually, we done a lot of simulations as analytical academic work. It works very, very, very well. I can give you one example. When we estimate poverty in India, we do not have India does release household survey data, and you can buy it for only $1,000 US. So we do that, every year. But the trouble is, last year when we did the poverty update for India, that time they said, oh, we are not ready to give you the data yet. So, but they give us the group data, yeah, quantile data. So 5 points for a country of India. And we try to estimate poverty. And not only inequality, actually, we are more confident with inequality, you basically try to estimate the Lorentz curve and but estimate poverty, that's a bit more challenging. So we used that methodology and we came up with a poverty estimate. We went to the representative, the government representative from India in the bank. We have board of directors. And we met with a lot of resistance. The executive director just won't let us go. Said, you cannot really use these five observations to try to come up with a poverty number for India. No, you cannot. So in the end, actually, it stopped us. We never actually launched that officially. Now, we are talking about that right now. Why are we talking about that now, releasing that number, which is different from the World Bank? Because earlier this year, we obtained the actual household level data. And the poverty rate we obtained from that 5 observations is almost identical. It differs by 0.01 percentage points, which is nothing. Yeah. So we are fairly confident. I mean, I'm using that example to tell you this methodology actually it works, and it works. I can tell you it works better for inequality than poverty. So we did a better job. We did a pretty good job with poverty. So I'm very confident on group this Chinese data into individual observations, and we can calculate inequality. So I'm not going to dwell on that. The second methodology, which is quite new in the literature, is inequality accounting. Of course, economists will be familiar with growth accounting. They try to figure out where the growth coming from. But inequality accounting is a fairly new thing, probably developed in the last 10 years or so. And I'm still part of this group working on this, try to accounting for inequality once you have data. And we'll see some of these results later on. And that's a 2-step procedure. Basically, you try to estimate a function, link your variable, which you want to estimate inequality, with its drivers. Then you come to this, break down this inequality, apply inequality on both sides of your equation, and come up with a methodology to that. Now, we don't really have time to give details, and I can simply mention that our methodology is actually quite good. It deals with any functional form, doesn't matter whether it's a linear, nonlinear, how many variables, and so on. And we can allow for any inequality indicator, and you can use Gini, tau index, X index, whatever index you want to use, and it allows interactions of your drivers in your function. And most importantly, our framework actually adds up. So always adds up 200%. If Gini coefficient is 0.43, you actually add up this 0.43, where attributes to all those X, which is quite important. Now, actually, we do have a software if someone wants to use that. So now comes to the measurement, come to the results. Yeah? I will go through that very quickly. And that's the inter-household inequality in China. I think we have data from 1977, that's right. So I managed to construct a time profile of inter-household income inequality for China from 1977 to 2010. It was a painstaking process, but we managed to obtain that. On this diagram, you see 3 lines. The top is the overall inequality in China. You can see that it decreased in the early reform period, then it started to grow almost uninterruptedly until very recently. In the last 3-5 years, you see this slight drop. And that's where some of the economists got excited. Say, oh, look, it's coming down. I'm not sure. I'm not saying they are wrong, but I'm not really convinced. It doesn't necessarily represent a long-run decline, long-run trend. Because if you say 3-5 years represent long-run trend, I mean, you can see the earlier period. When the reform started, inequality was declining for about 3-5 years as well. So that's overall. Then the middle is the inequality among rural residents. I mean, you will know that China is a country. Some people say China is a country of many countries. I would say China is a country of 2 worlds. You have the rural world and you have the urban world. And everybody, who familiar with the Chinese economy would really take these 2 separate worlds separately, not to really treat them as the same. And you can see that actually rural inequality is much higher than urban inequality. Urban inequality was fairly stable, as you can see the red line, until about the middle of 90s. And now I don't know, I haven't really done work to try to dig out why that happened since the mid-90s. And one, of course, major thing we know is this taxation reform in China. They had a huge, big reform in taxation system. And that may have been caused this rising in urban inequality in China. The other thing you will notice is this convergence between rural and urban inequality. Yeah, they are converging particularly in the last few years. And also, I want you to draw your attention to this declining inequality is really mainly caused by the rural inequality decline. And we know that that's where China started a lot of social protection programs in the rural areas. Started from probably 2006, where they completely abolished agriculture tax, which exists in China for over 1,000 years. The first time in Chinese history, over 1,000 years, they totally abolished agriculture tax completely. Then they start to introduce health insurance, age pension, and educational assistance, and so on from then. And that might be, I don't know, could be contributing to this decline in rural equality, of course, which is part of the overall inequality. But the thing is, if that is the case, that's a sort of one-time shock. It doesn't represent a long-run impact. I mean, that's where my suspicion comes from. Then the second diagram I want to show you is this urban-rural income ratio. As I said, China is not just one country. It's one country of two worlds. It's the urban world and the rural world. And on this diagram, you can see it's a urban over income per capita income ratio for all the provinces and over the years. Now, each the box, they call it box plot. Each box represents 1 year. So we have from about 79 to 2010 each year. And you can see, of course, the y-axis is a ratio. I mean, you can see some of the ratio is 5 to 1. In other words, in that particular province, urban income is 5 times the rural average income, which is quite dramatic. And of course, that's only within each province. We haven't really do the ratio between the richest province and the poorest province. And that sometimes it's they have numbers about 9 times or 10 times average income, not individual. And that's sort of a very, very sort of large disparity gaps between the rural and urban income. And you can actually see that if you focus on this box in the middle, that's where the distribution is. You can see that there's a fluctuation, but generally it's an increasing trend in the urban rural income ratio. And that actually has, later on I will come to that, that's actually the major component of inequality in China, overall inequality in China. So that was really the overall income inequality and the urban-rural issue. Then we come to regional inequality. As I mentioned, I also wanted to estimate regional inequality in China because that's where the Chinese government started this West development campaign. That's how they're based. And of course, I mean, you are right, regional inequality also has been increasing for many years. There are some fluctuations, but overall it's been increasing. And also similarly to the household inequality, rural inequality between regions is also higher than urban inequality between regions. So you see that urban inequality is always lower. You know why? Because the planned system before the reform. Because during the planned period, everybody gets same pay virtually. Very little income difference. And of course, it's already 30 years, but that impact has been still felt in China. Okay, now so we saw the trend, we saw the sorts of different aspects of inequality. Let's try to dig out what really are the major drivers of inequality. The first thing I did is look at the regional inequality. We saw earlier the top of this diagram is actually the total regional inequality I just showed you. And we can, through analytical methodology, we can break down that into two parts. One is the urban-rural gap I just shown. We said it's quite large. This rural-urban gap, how much that contributes to total regional inequality. And that's the sort of green component of this diagram. Then all the other factors, drivers, contributes to this red part. So what do we see here? Well, we can see that first, a large chunk, about 70% of total regional inequality are caused by this urban-rural gap. Only about 20-30% due to whatever the other factors. So that's the first important finding. The second finding, you will see that from this diagram, very simple diagram, you see that the changes in the total inequality, the fluctuation at the top, is all driven by this urban-rural gap. Because the bottom part, the red part, is fairly stable, particularly in recent years. If you look at since 1995, after 1995, where they started this major taxation reform, all the increases and changes in regional equality are accounted for by urban-rural gap, nothing else. You see, the red part is almost horizontal from 95. So this diagram actually highlights the dominance of urban-rural gap in China's regional inequality. Now you might ask, this is regional inequality. What about household inequality or individual inequality? How much this urban-rural gap contributes to the inter-household inequality? That's the decomposition we obtain. And again, the top part is the contribution due to urban-rural gap to inter-household inequality in China. And again, you see that, particularly recently, it accounts for about 50% of the overall inter-household inequality in China. So if you say, there are debates as to what sort of Gini coefficient in China is. Some say 0.48, high 40%. Some say might reach 0.5. But even say 0.5, and if you can eliminate this urban-rural gap, what will be the Gini coefficient? 0.25, which is actually pretty low. It's probably too low. So again, even in terms of this individual inequality, this urban-rural gap is very, very important. It's fundamental. Then what we did is, of course, in the paper you can read some other details, but we also did some inequality accounting. I want to simply show this table. And this is based on unofficial data. The earlier research findings, all based on official data. We did the ungrouping. Then we did all these breakdowns, decompositions. Here is the results based on unofficial data because we don't really have individual data from the government source. So we used some survey data conducted by individual researchers, came up with this inequality accounting. And you can see that this is, I also got to mention, this inequality is based in consumption, expenditure. So we know that expenditure inequality is lower than income inequality because there's consumption smoothing, there are sort of within household transfer and so on. So consumption inequality, but even by consumption inequality, the bottom is Gini coefficient. You can see that it's 44%. And that's quite high. That means income inequality probably reached about 50% in China. And we have sort of 2 years data, and we did 2 years decomposition. What you can see here is now, because it's only rounded to 2 decimal points, so you don't see the changes. Inequality seems same, actually increased from 95 to 2007. It doesn't show up there. But if you look at the last 2 columns, that's where the accounting results is. You can see among 100%. The province dummy contributes about 15%. Actually, that's the same for both years, in the mid-90s and late 2000. So the location is quite important. But above that, the urban dummy, which is representing the urban-rural gap, contributes, earlier period in the 90s contributes about 13%, but now contributing over 1/4 to overall inequality in China. Now you might say this is not consistent with your earlier results, but you got to remember the earlier results we only took urban-rural division. We did not consider other factors. Here we consider all the major drivers of income and income inequality. We have education, we have age, and then we have employment sectors where they employed. We have labor input, we have household size, and we have age composition, and so on. We basically took almost all the major sort of determinants of income and income inequality into consideration. And even considering that, 25% of the inequality is due to this urban-rural division in China. Then, of course, we have sector segregation, and I done a paper, and that's related, of course, to the policy recommendation, because you will know China gone from planned economy to market economy. They actually sold a lot of state-owned enterprises. Now the economy consists of probably 60-70% of private sector and 30% of probably state sector. But the trouble is, in the current leadership actually push forward the state sectors, and they try to actually at the expense of private sector. It's a lot of complaints in China. And it's causing a lot of problems as well, because this monopoly in China, the telecommunication, the energy sector, the road sector, these people earning huge amount of income, salaries, wages, and benefits. But you still have, over 120 million people living under $1.25 a day. And people do blame this monopoly in China, the dominance of state sector in China. Right now, the Chinese government is facing with this huge problem. You might heard in the news, recently the World Bank launched this report in China. The president was there, the deputy prime minister of China was there. Then they had this guy stepped on the stage, said, get out of China, World Bank, and you try to privatize the Chinese economy, and you really try to sell China and so on. And it's caused a big outcry. But then, people ask me, what to do with this problem, because the monopoly is, we know that as economists, it's actually costs us efficiency and also costs us equality as well. But what are we going to do if we're not going to privatize, if we're not going to allow international competition? I don't know. But what I'm saying here is really the sector segregation, the monopoly, is also quite important in contributing to overall inequality in China. And that, of course, will have implications for policy as far as policy implications are concerned. And of course, there are some other inequality contributions.
I was wondering when you want to go on to your policy.
Oh, you want to come to policy?
I was wondering whether this particular section, very short section, I wonder if you went on to policy, we might give time for discussion.
Right, sure. So I'm going to skip this. There are some other, of course, drivers, which we don't have to discuss in detail. So comes to policy recommendations. The first is, of course, we've got to tackle the urban-rural gap, because we've shown that it's not only a guess, but it's analytically we saw that it's the dominant, the most important factor causing inequality at any level along different dimensions in China. So I actually propose fast urbanization. Now, I'm saying fast urbanization because last year the Chinese government started the new 5-year plan. And before the new 5-year plan, ADB was consulted, of course, IMF, World Bank, and they brought this top economists from Harvard, from Stanford to China, tried to talk about urbanization. And I was hopeful, actually I was involved, I was hopeful the Chinese government will set up a sort of a higher target of urbanization, because I believe urbanization is very important for, at least as far as inequality is concerned. Not mentioning efficiency. We know that urbanization is good for efficiency, but even for inequality. But unfortunately, and very disappointingly, Chinese government set a pretty low urbanization rate. By 2030, 60%. And of course, some of you will know the McKinney actually released a report. They proposed about 66%. I'm actually proposing 80% urbanization rate by 2030, because as far as the inequality is concerned, there are only two options for you to try to solve this urban-rural gap, which is the largest component. One is taxation and a fiscal transfer, right? So you take from those who has jobs, who has some income, and then you give to the poor rural people. But given this huge gap, given the large proportion of rural people, at the moment, officially 60% of population are rural, but this 40%, among the 40 urban residents, they are not real urban residents. Those people with urban hukou or their household registration only is about 30%. So you really talk about 30%, they are not very rich, the 30%. They're well off, they're better off. 30% not so rich people try to help the 70% of poor rural people. How long can you do that? You cannot do it, right? So shifting resource from urban to rural is not going to work no matter what you do. And that's shown already in the last 20 years or so, Chinese government has been trying to do that. And they try to initiate this campaign of socialist countryside. I mean, initiated by my friend Justin Lin, the senior vice president of the World Bank. But I've been saying to him, this is wrong. You can't expect the rural sector to continue to grow or grow faster than the non-rural sector. It's just economists know that. I mean, even non-economists will know that. How could you expect that? No matter how much government support you give to the rural areas, right? So shifting resource, supporting agriculture is not going to work. Then there's no other option. The other way is allow rural people come to the urban area to share the growth benefits. And that requires true urbanization. Allow them to settle in the urban areas, give them training, help them with housing, education, health, and so on. So that's where I propose this 80%, and it causes a big trouble in China. I mean, wherever I go, people say, you are ridiculous, 80%, because by definition, US urbanization rate is 81% today. And you talk about China 2030. Now, China will grow, but not that rich, and you talk about 80%. But I said, if you want to solve the inequality problem, and even doing 80% is not going to really eliminate the inequality problem. It will help to moderate the inequality problem in China. So that's the first, and it's a controversial, I have to admit, fairly controversial. But I also can tell you, I'm actually gaining support from various parts. I mean, when I give this talk in Peking University, the top university in China, before the talk, the vice president was said, Guanghua, I like you, but I don't like your proposal. After the talk, he was silent. And then over lunch, after another 15 minutes check, he said, you're going to come back to Peking University, go to the largest scale of seminar. You got to tell people why that is the case. 80% is important. And then I had supports from even US academics at various seminars. They said, oh, we're not sure, but after your talk, yeah, it seems to make sense. Yeah. So the second, so that's a first policy recommendation, and it's not a simple one. Actually, you must see quite simple, just urbanization, but it's not that simple. The second one is, of course, pro-migrant social protection and training. It's very important. Now, at the moment, they do train rural people in China. They have this leading group on poverty, a ministry level guy doing training. But the trouble is, they only can do training in rural areas at the origin, which is a bit difficult, which is not efficient, which may not be really effective. So what I'm saying is really, you got to train these people, you're going to spend money on these people, you should give them social protection. But instead of helping them in the origin, help them after they come to the cities. That's my proposal. So helping solve China's rural peasant farming problem in the urban areas. That's my saying. And sometimes, foreigners got confused. How could you help? Because in China, they have 3 rural problems. Yeah, rural economy, rural people, and the farming sector, and they call it Sanlong, 3 agriculture, 3 rural. And they're being focused, the government, always focused on the rural areas, solve this problem. I'm saying you got to solve this problem, but not there, in the urban areas. And that's where this sort of pro-migrant social protection and training. You can see more details in the paper. And earlier I mentioned, I want to propose downsize this social limbs new countryside funding, because at the moment, I think they proposed 30 trillion funding, 30 trillion Chinese currency, still a lot of money over 10, 15 years to fund this program. I'm proposing to downsize that. To downsize that, not sort of taking away from the rural people, but putting into the urban area to help the migrants. Yeah. Rather than sort of building more roads, building high-rise buildings in the rural area, which I said, look, after 15 years, it's already happening actually in China. Even schools are becoming idle. Nobody uses that school anymore. Some roads are becoming useless. You spend a lot of money on the 10, 15 years. Why do you do that? It's a waste of resources. So that's as far as urban-rural gap, 3 major policy recommendations. What about regional inequality? Well, regional equality, the first policy recommendation is fiscal transfer. Now, I don't know, earlier we had people saying, fiscal transfer in some other countries also sort of regressive, but in China, it's been regressive for many, many years. And we've got to make that progressive rather than regressive. I know China is making progress on that front already, but we should emphasize that. On the taxation front, you will know China started growth by supporting the coastal areas. That's where they start, through the taxation policy, they give tax concessions to FDI, to enterprises. That has more or less phased out, no longer exists in China anymore. But what I'm saying is they should, reinstitute this policy, but in the inland areas. Help the inland areas. Now, we know this industrial transfer is happening already in China, but it's very slow, and it's not working very well. They transfer, many industries actually moving away from China, from the coastal areas, instead of moving to the inland areas. That's what the Chinese governments expect or hope. But what's happening, they move to Southeast Asia. And that's where I think China should really design policies, try to keep those industries, keep those FDIs in China. And of course, it's becoming so expensive in the coastal areas. The enterprises cannot afford anymore, so that's why they're moving away. But they can move to inland, where it's still much cheaper than coastal areas. And quite importantly, it's this capital development. In China, we mentioned earlier, this sort of money is being so cheap. I think it's so cheap, but probably nowhere so cheap in China. It's very, very cheap in China. But the main point I'm making is this cheap money is not for everybody. It's not even for medium-sized enterprises. It's mostly or most exclusively for the state-owned enterprises. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised. I have friends running, sort of $1 million or even, $1 billion of private enterprises. They cannot borrow from the banks, and they have a lot of money there. I mean, we know that China has a lot of money, but they don't really help the small and the medium-sized enterprise. And people are proposing that, but I don't know when that will materialize. So capital market development in China is very, very crucial. Another thing is this incentivize local government. Nobody raised that question for solving inequality. What's happening is in China, the politicians are being promoted based on their performance. And that's a good thing. And that's, a lot of people are saying that's why China has been growing so fast. And it's been growing almost everywhere. Even in poor areas, you also grow because these politicians from the top to the bottom try to push up growth. Then they can get a promotion. And a promotion means everything. So they have that system throughout. I mean, even though it's a big, huge country and a diverse country, but everybody is pushing growth. And that's why China has been growing. And it has been growing for over 30 years. The trouble is they ignored equity issues. They focus exclusively on growth, on efficiency. And that's where I'm proposing, in your sort of performance radar, you got to really let inequality indicators come in to the play. So I'm actually in the paper, I proposed an indicator combining growth and inequality when they're going to assess the politician's performance. And we know that once you do that, the politician will follow. I don't know. I mean, they are still politically opponent, but these guys are good. You know that. They can get things done in China. I mean, that's a major thing, actually, if you compare China with India. I mean, they can do bad things, they can do good things, but they can get things done if they want to. I mean, that's the main thing. And if you do this, you put this inequality in their assessment, they will get things done. And we know that at one stage, China wanted to bring environmental issues into GDP, discount. And of course, that was stopped in the middle. But we know that once they bring that local assessment, the environmental issue will be tackled quite well. But it didn't happen. So I'm hoping, I don't know whether that's going to happen. That's only my own wish, whether the Chinese government will do. But it is a serious issue. I hope the government one day will take this into consideration. There are, of course, a number of, earlier, this is based on the earlier research finding, but there are some policy reforms we got to, I'm proposing. One is centralized social protection. Now, as I mentioned, we do have social protection started, in the last 3-5 years, and it is actually good for sort of improving equality. But the trouble is, most of the social protection are localized. The big problem, deficiency of this problem is people, it impedes mobility in China. And of course, mobility actually, of course, is bad for equality, for equity concern. And that's where we try to propose you got to centralize the social protection system to allow this fiscal transfer to become progressive and portable. Portability is the main argument, main point here. The second part is, is this urban-rural gap. Now, the urban world enjoys a lot of protection and high-level protection. The rural people only started to have protection, which is good, from none to little. But I think China should try to really make these two converge. That's very important for them to reform this household registration system. I mean, people, I'm sure the Chinese government can just overnight through one piece of paper said, gone, the household registration system. But the trouble is you have a lot of, policy sort of costs there. How do you implement that? You have 60% of rural people, if 30% move into the urban areas over a couple of years. How do you really do this social protection? Because urban households enjoys 10 times of social protection of rural people. And that's going to cause huge problems. So what I'm saying is they should try to gradually make these two converge, narrow down that difference. I mean, what I'm saying is maybe they can sort of not increase the urban social protection amount, still keep them there, not sort of tied up with CPI, not tied up with growth, but let the rural people sort of grow the social protection. So until a certain stage, this household registration system becomes useless. It doesn't matter anymore. You don't even have to reform it. Because a lot of people are pushing for reforming this household registration system, which to me, it doesn't mean anything. They can't just say, no, it doesn't exist anymore. But it's not going to be helpful as long as the social welfare sort of protection differs between these two groups. And you need time, and you need steps to do that. And another point is introduce this PPP, which is called private-public partnerships. I mean, in other words, I'm really suggesting entry of private capital into some of the monopoly enterprises in China and allow for foreign competition to break up the state monopoly, which is politically sensitive, but I would think China must do that. I mean, one way or another. Another issue, recommendation is this land quota trading and social housing. I mean, for the urbanization, 80%, it's a huge task. It never happened in human history. But basically, there are two things you got to do for the migrants. One is job. You got to let them have certain jobs, whether formal, informal, highly paid or low paid. They got to have jobs. Now, I don't know whether in my paper, but elsewhere in my research, I actually did calculations. Job-wise, they are okay. A lot of actual research found migrants. We have about 250 million migrants at the moment in cities. 250 million. They are not urban residents. They don't enjoy anything, but they're not illegal. Almost are illegal migrants in the urban areas. But over 94% of them always have jobs. It's even better than the urban residents. So jobs-wise, they are okay. Now we want to improve their working conditions and so on and so on, but that's a different matter, I guess. The other thing is really housing. I mean, that's the concern. I'm very much concerned because you can buy housing, but the trouble is housing prices in China skyrocket. I mean, some of you may hear the report. The Chinese government put this sort of, the current prime minister is still betting on his name actually in history for this issue. He apologized. Never happened. Apologized just as was a week or 2 weeks ago to the whole world. Said he's sorry he did not do his job well because the housing price is so high in urban areas. Well, I mean, the urban areas, the one implication from our perspective is really, even you allow the migrants to go to the cities, you give the social benefits as well, same, but they cannot afford the housing. It's so expensive. I mean, even me, if I go to Shanghai or Beijing, I cannot afford buy a house in Beijing, and how do they settle? So, and that's where this proposal is. What are we doing is, there's a good thing in China is every migrant have land. You know that, right? And in the 50s, they had this land reform. So everyone has a piece of land back in the countryside. Now, of course, the land in the urban fringe becomes so expensive. A lot of millionaires being produced. I mean, you see some farm reports in the newspaper, the farmers has no education, drive BMWs to farming. drive a couple of kilometers, living in a sort of high-rise building and drive there to do farming. And not really much farming work, but that's the problem. That's the situation because they had land near the urban areas so expensive, so they sold that land and they pocketed large chunk of it. But a lot of remote areas, the land doesn't really it's not worth anything. And that's where these people are needing help for migration and urbanization. On the other hand, in China, every city has certain quota for sort of urban buildings, from the government. You can only have, 500 hectares this year for urban expansion, And then actually this quota from the central government to provincial government to county government to the local government, it goes like that. What we are proposing is, so far for many years, when they buy the land belongs to the state ownership, belongs to the state. The government, of course, will give part to the farmers, to whoever own that, not re-owned, usership, that land. The large part goes to the government for urban construction, for infrastructure. That's why you see sort of high-rise buildings, beautiful roads. This underground building in China is getting crazy. You have the trams but that's all funded from this. But the problem with that's not sustainable, and also it's not really helping the right people. Those actually people migrated from the remote areas. So what we're proposing is actually they can give up their land back in their home country, right? That land is not really worth much. But what they could do is they can come to a city, then the central government can allocate this quota to this city where they're going to accept this migrant. So suppose they give 1 hectare in, I don't know where, but Russia, it's with nothing, it's desert, right? They give 1 hectare. They come to Shanghai, the richest city. Shanghai government, of course, want more land because they make a lot of money out of it. It's worth a lot of money, the land in Shanghai. But the government won't give them that much. It's fixed. So what they do is, if they're going to accept 1 migrant from the area bordering Russia, and that family has, say, 1 hectare land, the central government, that land will go back to the central government because it's state-owned. They can give Shanghai 1 hectare of quota extra. And that 1 hectare worth millions. And that millions of dollars, part of that can go to the migrant, part of that can fund social housing, and part of that can go for urban infrastructure. So, yeah, sure. Yeah. I guess I'm not going to, actually I can stop here.